Hello, welcome back. Here is Ali Talabi, and this is Module 12, Portfolio Management. So in this module, we'll have two lessons. First, we'll talk about portfolio. What does it mean? So I will introduce some jargons related to the notion of portfolio. Then we'll talk about the risk and return and how we measure return and risk for a portfolio. And we'll talk about one of the major topics in investment, which is diversification. And I'm just going to show you how actually that diversification works in the content of portfolio. In the second lesson, we'll focus on MPT or modern portfolio theory, and I will mention that how we actually can create a risk-free portfolio, and I will show you that actually at least on the paper it can happen. So I will talk about the conditions, and finally we'll wrap up with distinguishing between the market and the unique risk, and which I will say that's an introduction to the next module when we talk about CAPM or capital asset pricing model. So let's start our lesson. So what is the portfolio? So let's talk about portfolios. Portfolios are groups of assets such as stocks, bonds that are held by an investor. So when you are buying at least two assets, two stocks, or one stock, one bond, or combination of assets, you are holding actually a portfolio. When we talk about the different assets, for sure, you assign different weights for each asset in the portfolio. So the proportion of the asset in the portfolio is based on the weight. So you can calculate the weight. For example, you have $10,000. You are investing $5,000 on a stock A and $5,000 on a stock B. So you can say 50% of your portfolio is dedicated to stock A, 50% is for stock B. Again, these are called the portfolio weights. So the weights of assets in your portfolio. And most of times we state these weights in terms of percentage. So say 50%, 20%. So a specific percentage you are investing in a specific asset in your portfolio. Now, when it comes to expected returns, we don't have a very challenging job actually to calculate the expected return. Because the expected return on portfolio is based on the weighted average of the expected returns on the assets in that portfolio. So if you know the return of each individual asset, so just find the weights as we discussed previously and multiply the weights by the expected return, add them all, and you will find the expected return for your portfolio. So here is the formula we use to calculate the expected return. So we can use the same formula when it comes to historical return as well. So if, for example, for the last year you invested in several assets or stocks, and you want to see what was your return for your portfolio, use the same formula. Just instead of the expected return, use the historical or the actual return, and use the weights based on the value of your investment. So you can find the expected return, not a big deal. However, what is the whole logic? What is the whole argument for the portfolio or having a portfolio? For sure, that's a very common term. You heard that, don't put all your eggs in one basket. But technically, what does it mean? It means, in a very simple, plain English, it means diversification. It means that we know that some assets, due to several reasons, they will go down in terms of the price, their value is going down. On the other side, there are some assets which their value is going up. So the point here is there is a very low chance that at the same time all the assets are going on the same direction, or for example, all of them are going down. So you are forming a portfolio to diversify your investment, to reduce the chance of losing your money. Make sense? So you can have a more expected return if you go and form a portfolio. In other words, or more specifically, you can reduce the amount of your investment risk if you diversify your investment. But maybe you say, Ali, how this kind of diversification is working, how I can reduce my risk when I'm forming a portfolio. So let's talk about this in more details. Actually, the magic or the major reason we have this diversification is behind the notion of correlation. So maybe you remember the term correlation from your stat class, or maybe you heard about that. But in a very simple way, the correlation shows that how two assets or how two stocks are moving together. In other words, we want to see that when one asset is going up, what happens to another asset? It's going down or is going up? How well two assets are moving together. So when we have the correlation of -1, we can say that these two assets are moving on opposite direction in a perfect way. If you have the correlation of +1, it means two assets are moving in the same direction perfectly. For example, if one asset is going up by 10% and another asset is going up by also 10%, that's a correlation of +1. Correlation is always a number between -1 and +1. So it might be 0, it might be 0.2, 0.3, anywhere between -1 and +1, or -100% and +100%. So what is the point here? The point here is just your goal here is to form a portfolio, to add assets which they have a negative correlation with your current assets. Why? Because when you have the negative correlation, it means that they cancel out the effect of each other. They cancel out the movement of each other. Remember, we talked about the risk. We already talked about the risk before. The risk means volatility. You want just to make sure you are able to reduce the volatility of your investment. That's the meaning of risk management. That's the meaning of risk reduction. So your goal here is to add assets which they have a negative correlation. So most of the time it's kind of difficult to find -1 correlation. So, but anyway, it's kind of easier to find some assets which are negatively correlated with your current investments. So that's the whole notion of correlation and why diversification works. Now, we talk about the correlation, we talk about the return of individual assets. So remember, when we talk about the variance of the portfolio, we learned we use the variance to measure the risk or volatility. We use the same measurement for the portfolio. However, there is a big difference here, and the big difference is actually behind the notion of correlation. Here is the formula we use to measure the variance of the portfolio. As you see, it's not just based on the weighted average of individual assets risks or variance, but also we are adding the correlation to our equation. So weight of assets, variance of assets, plus the correlation between the assets return is a major determinant of the variance of the portfolio. Here is the formula we use, and we also know that for two assets, this is, I'm assuming we have just two asset portfolio here, the total value of your investment should be 100%. So weight of asset A plus weight of asset B is 100%. So that's the variance for to calculate the two asset portfolio, the risk of two asset portfolio. For sure, you can expand your portfolio. You can go with 3 assets, 4 assets. However, the variance calculation becomes much more complicated. But most of times we are focusing on 2 assets to see actually how the diversification works and how we can measure the risk. And remember, since we have the correlation help us actually to reduce the risk. So in other words, the variance of your investment will be, the variance of your portfolio will be less than the variance of individual assets. Why? Again, because you have the correlation there, so you can minimize the risk of your investment to some degree when you're adding more assets to your portfolio. In the second lesson, we will talk more about diversification, and more specifically, I will talk about the notion of MPT, or modern portfolio theory. Till then, have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon. And here is Ali Talabi.